host, but I'm also a BBC News presenter behind Newsbeat on Radio 1. So it's a pleasure to be here. Today, I think, promises to be the start of conversations, prompting thoughts, and hopefully some of that is what you take away about the future of the UK media industry, what it can do, and the people we make content for, what it can do for audiences, for society. So there's a lot to get into. Of course, you don't need me to tell you there's also a lot going on in the world, from politics, conflicts, but also changing tech and habits. So perhaps today can be a bit of a pause for us all to kind of think about what parts of that might affect our industry. We're going to get into quite a lot of those topics with what you're going to be hearing, but a few bits of housekeeping first. No planned fire drills. If you hear the alarm, leave. There's exits either side of the stage, and also if we could ask that nobody takes any photographs, that would be appreciated. Now, hopefully you're all caffeinated because you're going to be taking in quite a lot, but it's all going to be hopefully fruitful. We're going to be hearing from the chair of the BBC for the first time since being in the role. There's going to be some time for me to leave some questions, and also if there's anything you want to ask as well, keep that in mind. There'll be some time for that at the end. But first, please welcome Samir Shah, no stranger to the industry, but for the first time as chairman of the BBC.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in this wonderful cultural venue and this great city. Thank you all for coming. It's an immense privilege and responsibility to stand before you today as the 26th chairman of the BBC, an institution that holds a unique place in the fabric of our national life and the global media. For me, it's been the background music to my life, both as a child in India and growing up in the UK. My job as chair is to defend the licence fee payer and act in the public interest. And you know, the public are interested in the BBC. Currently, 95% of people in this country consume BBC services monthly. Today, I'm going to begin by talking about British PSBs in general and the challenges we collectively face. I will identify 3 actions that will, I hope, help meet those challenges. In the second half of my speech, the rule of 3 will also apply. In this case, though, I shall be setting out some of the issues I shall focus on during my time as the BBC's chair. Now, there's an unwritten rule that every big BBC speech must begin with a showreel of the BBC's greatest programmes. Who am I to disagree?
The Namib in southwest Africa.
I've never heard of the Namib, Ronnie.
No.
But there's a problem.
What's the problem?
What's the problem?
The chicks won't survive another day in these temperatures. They must depart.
Oh, they can't leave. They still got some eggs there, man.
Oh, Jane.
Oh, no. Oh, I've got no mum and dad.
They're Ronnie there. Can't you see them? Fucking 2 big birds.
It's dying.
Can't be dead. I think he's dead.
This ain't entertainment.
No, stop it.
Oh, look, he's pecking up.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Computer system post office spent an arm and a leg on is faulty.
No one else has ever reported any problems with Horizon. No one.
You're responsible for the loss.
I haven't got that money, and I don't know where it's gone.
These deficits were most likely caused by you. That is the post office case.
All our hopes, all our savings down the pan.
That was a lie. actually. We're fighting a war against an enemy owned by the British government, while we're just skint little people.
This is about the reputation of the post office.
It's not, it's about people's lives, you moron.
Finally, 555 of us now, ready to tell our stories.
Hello? That's wonderful news, thank you.
Good luck, Dougie!
Good luck, Dougie!
Good luck, Dougie.
Don't worry, old boy. She's going to be fine.
Blankety blank, blankety blank, boom boom, blankety blank, blankety blank, boom boom. And joining us on the panel tonight, blankety blank, Stephanie Button, Catherine Hyatt, Humphrey Bone, Thomas Thorne, Robin, and the rest of Humphrey Bone. Blankety blank.
So, what do all those shows have in common? Well, of course, they were all made by British public service broadcasters, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, and the BBC. And they all tell stories about this country, programs of the UK, about the UK, for the UK. This is the result of decades of evolution, beginning over 100 years ago with the BBC, followed by ITV's regional-based structure, which actually included London Weekend Television, where I started my own career in broadcasting, and later the emergence of Channel 4 and Channel 5. The outcome is a very British success story, with public and private sectors collaborating to create a balanced media ecosystem. The impact of this on British society is immeasurable, spanning three key dimensions. First, economic. PSBs have been crucial to the growth of our world-class creative sector. More than that, they underpin it. Look at how big it is, the GVA is, compared to everything else. Second, social. From Channel 4's mission to give voice to marginalized communities and Radio 4's everyday story of country folk, The Archers, to ITV's Coronation Street, PSBs have long reflected British society in all its diversity. And thirdly, cultural. PSBs have always shaped and influenced the national debate, not least by pulling together the nation as one people, sharing a collective experience, whether in outrage, like Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, or in joy when Andy Murray victory at Wimbledon, or in sadness, the death of Her Majesty the Queen. And arguably, there is a fourth factor, which matters particularly to me, given my own background in news. PSBs have a deep commitment to impartial news, especially now, as opinionated news is where the commercial market is taking us. No other country has anything like this. PSBs lie at the heart of our social and cultural life, and they are worth fighting for. And to be frank, the fight is on. That's because the exciting new world of choice now being offered in the digital environment has real consequences for PSBs. And today, there is so much choice. Look at it all. It's fantastic, isn't it? Is this a good thing? Well, of course it is. I dare say many of you have a few subscriptions. I certainly do. From slow horses to Stranger Things, from Champions League football to Test match cricket, my leisure time has been infinitely enriched by the options now available to me. But you know, it's a double-edged sword. because the focus of big international players is a global market, which inevitably does not prioritize local stories. Today, industry analysts estimate that if you're watching traditional broadcast TV, around 80% of the content on offer will be British. On the other hand, if you're watching on demand, it's only about 10%. Now, some might say, so what? The digital market has spoken, and we should let our exceptional, precious, and unique PSB ecology wither on the vine. I don't agree. Of course, we should embrace and welcome the exciting opportunities of the on-demand world. But that doesn't mean we can't try and shape the choices people have in this new media landscape to benefit the public good. Action is now needed to future-proof PSBs in the digital age. Otherwise, our very British success story will be part of our halcyon past. So what should be done? Well, there are many answers to that question, but today I want to set out 3 areas that I shall be focusing on. First, I want to make sure that the public can continue to have easy access to PSB content. This was achieved before. Let's have a look. You all recognize the EPG, how we get linear channels today. The fact that PSB is the first 5 didn't happen by happenstance. It was a result of the 2003 Communication Act that established prominence for PSBs in the EPG, allowing easy discovery of high-quality content. This prominence is now at risk. Now look, a typical smart TV home screen. There is no EPG in sight. The people in charge of where and how the BBC and other PSBs appear in this landscape are the TV platforms and manufacturers. Of course, it's perfectly and completely rational that they want to prioritize their own services, their own content, their own data for their own commercial interests. But just as before, if we want to preserve our very British success story, we need to secure easy and simple access to PSB content on every platform. My plan in the coming months is to work with my PSB colleagues and together impress upon the government and Ofcom the importance of significant prominence in the implementation of the new Media Act. The second area where I shall be encouraging change is regulation. Of course, there's no question we should be regulated. We receive a very large amount of public money, and so there's an absolute need for proper accountability. But I'm arguing today for a more forward-looking regulatory approach. And that's because we still operate in a regulatory landscape that was fundamentally designed 20 years ago. It was built for a world that no longer exists, a world where PSBs were the dominant players and our competitors needed protection. Let me give you an example of what happened. Project Kangaroo, this is. 15 years ago, there was a joint initiative called Project Kangaroo from BBC, ITV and Channel 4 to enter the video-on-demand market. The Competition Commission blocked it on the grounds that it was too much of a threat to the emerging VOD market. The result? Well, we know the result, don't we? Netflix, Disney, Apple, Amazon, they steal the march on us. And we are still playing catch-up. The speed at which regulatory processes come to a decision also puts us on the back foot. The BBC is currently about halfway through what is likely to be a year-long process to launch 4 new music radio station extensions, our first, by the way, for over 20 years, in response to changes in audience listening habits. Meanwhile, in the last few weeks alone, commercial radio has launched 13 new radio stations and over 40 in the past 6 years. Now, of course, BBC plans involving public money should be scrutinized and assessed. But does it all have to take so long? You know, it's a classic case of unintended consequences. What we have witnessed is a PSB system being held back as it tries to reinvent itself for the digital age. We need a regulatory system that enables Ofcom to support us and help us thrive in this rapidly changing world. PSBs need to be able to move with greater agility, flexibility, and pace. We need the freedom to think innovatively and creatively about how we work with each other, collaborating where it makes sense and competing where it matters. Above all, we need a regulatory framework that is focused on the future and regulates for growth. So my second task will be to press, in concert with our fellow PSBs, for a regulatory framework that helps rather than hinders our response to the changing media landscape. The other PSBs will have their own priorities here, and I won't speak on their behalf. But when it comes to the BBC Public Service, could we, for example, speed up the public interest test process? BBC Studios' job, meanwhile, is to make as much money as it can out of BBC programming in the global marketplace, which it does very well indeed. But could we loosen the reins on our commercial activities so it can do even better? These are important questions for us to find answers to. My third call for action is really for government and policymakers to consider. It's not so much about promoting and protecting British PSBs per se, but on future-proofing our creative industries as a whole. The PSBs can point to decades of investment in making sure that the UK has a strong pipeline of homegrown talent, actors, writers, cinematographers, musicians, directors, makeup artists. The list is endless, far too many crafts and skills to list. But as the big global players increasingly dominate, how best can we keep that pipeline of talent flowing? Let me be clear, the global media and tech giants are investing in this country, and that's a very good thing. Studios and streamers provide jobs for our wonderfully talented creative sector. And for many of our biggest production companies, choosing the UK for film and television production is critical for their business. As other countries seek to lure such productions to their shores with tax incentives, it's vital that the government continues to compete by offering generous tax credits. Of course, studios and streaming services do nurture local talent and support the film and television industry. But is it enough? Look at this on spend. Look at how much BBC spend and look at how much Netflix spend. So, could the tax credit system do more? Are there other levers we could pull? I want to safeguard against the UK being treated as an IP farm where we can simply harvest our top talent without helping meaningfully to future-proof our creative sector. I'm particularly concerned for smaller companies, support for creative talent at the lower level of the industry, and of course, investing across the country. Now is the right time to ask how we can best incentivize UK production in ways that can also support training and skills in every part of the UK from the grassroots up. So my third call is to protect the grassroots. As chair, I will engage with PSBs and talk to government about what more could be done to make sure the tax system and the policy environment not only benefits the big players, but supports training and skills for the whole sector in every part of the UK. So, my three tasks for British PSBs. British PSBs have, over the years, created something quite wonderful. We should work together as a sector to future-proof this precious asset and put it at the heart of the growth strategy that is key to the future prosperity of this country. So I will work with my fellow PSBs to press our legislators and regulators to take action on these fronts. To invert the cliche, let us act fast so that we don't repent at leisure. To turn now to the BBC. I've been in the job for 8 months. First impressions? The good news. I said when I was appointed, a general election is the BBC News' World Cup. And despite being called early, we were match fit. Our election night coverage on TV reached almost 3 times as many people as the nearest competitor. And even better, our impartiality scores were up. Elsewhere, an extraordinary summer of sport, the Olympics, the Euros, combined with Glastonbury and the Proms, moved the dial in terms of bringing audiences to the BBC. Despite all this excellent output, there's been no shortage of sound and fury around the BBC. Our journalism has been tested by one of the most difficult stories in recent times, the Middle East conflict. Now more than ever in this deeply polarizing story, we need to double down on the defining qualities of impartial journalism, accuracy, seeking truth, and the importance of hearing all sides of opinion with respect and courtesy. And of course, there have been and are concerns about unacceptable behaviour in the BBC. I and the BBC board take this matter very seriously and are determined to root out abuses of power. We have seen significant progress in recent years, and certainly much better since I began my career 40 years ago. Nevertheless, there continues to be a sense that powerful people get away with it. That people who have had the courage to complain are left dangling. That more visible action needs to be taken when someone is found to have crossed the line. And frankly, for everything to be done a great deal quicker. We clearly need to do more. And the Workplace Culture Review currently underway will, I believe, help us move rapidly forward. Now let me turn to the strategic issues facing the BBC. And it's time, surely, for me to conform to the tradition and play you a proper BBC showreel. Actually, I'm only going to play you one thing, but my God, watch.
The Treason Act. I see its tripwire. It is a crime now to envisage a future beyond the life of our present king.
In past months, you've spoken with the Emperor's man, Chapuis, and assured him that England's ready to rise against its king. Don't interrupt me. The common law has ways to protect the realm from traitors, madam. I mean an act of attainder, by which all property and lands are seized without need of trial. Why don't you write a letter to Lady Mary?
Saying what?
Saying what? Saying the king is to be obeyed.
You will carry it?
Give it to your friend, Ambassador Chapuis. That way the lady cannot say it's forged.
You are a snake, Cromwell.
Oh, no. A dog, madam. And on your scent.
My gosh, it really is, isn't it? Mark Rylance, can anybody deliver a line like Mark Rylance can? Now, I was too late to visit the set of Wolf Hall, but I have been out and about a fair bit, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Cardiff, all over England, meeting people, and I'm looking forward next week to my trip to Belfast. What I hear on my travels is the sound of BBC producers, directors, editors, researchers, writers, and many, many more working their socks off to make the best programs they can possibly make. I know this because I was one of them less than a year ago. We worked tirelessly, often through the night, in some godforsaken cutting room, editing and re-editing a film, so that it is the very best we can do. Why do we do this? Because we all believe in the BBC. We love working for the BBC. We believe it is a profound force for good in this country and central to our social and cultural life. We believe its values reflect ours. No other country has a broadcaster that does what the BBC does for the UK. It is one of our truly world-class organisations. It is recognised and respected wherever you go. Director General Tim Davies' recent encapsulation of what the BBC is for was spot on. Impartial journalism that seeks out truth, a focus on homegrown storytelling and gathering the nation so we can celebrate together and grieve together. For all its faults, what an extraordinary achievement by the people of this country the BBC is. Only here, with our pathological addiction to running ourselves down, do we call that into question. Only here do we take a perverse delight in bashing our finest national institutions. Only here are we prepared to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In my view, and it is certainly the view of the rest of the world, there is no doubt that without the BBC, this country would be much diminished. Now, while there will be many matters I will have to attend to during my time as chair, I want to turn now to 3 areas which will be my particular focus. I was struck recently listening to this. Frank Skinner, in conversation with our own Amal Rajan on the Today podcast about opportunity, and how he felt that growing up in the West Midlands, nothing seemed possible.
Most of the bad times in my life I've got through by self-dramatisation. So this guy, you know, going down trying to learn how to be a comic, sleeping in his car, even as I was doing it, I was thinking, this is pretty romantic.
Yeah, but you know, it's something, I mean, we'll get onto the football in a second, but social mobility is a subject very close to my heart. I also made a bunch of documentaries, and the biggest discovery that I made was the importance of A, geography, and B, accent. And the point about geography was I didn't realise the extent to which, because I'm a, you know, Londoner, the extent to which not being from London holds you back in an extraordinary way. And so many people with such talent have to leave to achieve. They have to get away from Smethwick. They have to go to London.
That phrase, leave to achieve, really stuck with me. For the BBC to fulfil its responsibility to the whole of the UK, we need to make sure that many more people can pursue an ambitious, successful career with a national broadcaster without having to move to London. The BBC is funded and owned by the public. It can only be truly accountable to everyone if it serves everyone wherever they live. By doing so, the BBC can better articulate the full diversity of thought and opinion that exists in this country. This is not a new ambition. DGs and chairs have been calling for it for years. Even I voiced it back in 2008 when I wrote a chapter in a book called The Price of Plurality, advocating that the BBC should evolve into a federation of small entities with real power. I'm afraid the book is no longer available at all good bookshops. Actually, I rather doubt there was. The first phase of the BBC's response to this was perhaps more words than action. And that action largely confined to executives using their national rail card to travel up and down the country from their base in London. Since then, we have embarked upon a much more substantial decentralisation. Programmes, people and production have been steadily moving out of London for many years. This major project is well underway, not least for the BBC News teams that have recently relocated here in Leeds. And of course, there are now major production offices in Cardiff, in Glasgow, in Belfast, in Birmingham, and Bristol, and of course, Salford. The BBC's move to Salford is a wonderful success story. And with BBC Breakfast, Morning Live, and now the News at 1, large parts of the BBC One schedule now come from Greater Manchester. And that's before I mention children's programmes, Radio 5 Live and sport. I was very pleased to hear the Culture Secretary describe Media City as one of the best examples of levelling up that this country has ever seen. I'm keen that we dial up our commitment to devolve, or perhaps more precisely, to further distribute the BBC around the country. We need to drive more BBC jobs, teams and programmes across the UK. We want audiences to really feel the BBC is connected to their community. And we also want the conversation we heard between Frank Skinner and Amal Rajan to be a thing of the past, from leave to achieve to stay and succeed. There are two further priorities that I want to highlight today, and both are connected to the board's core responsibility to uphold the independence of the BBC and increase its accountability to audiences. Over the next few years, the debate around the BBC will be dominated by the renewal of our Royal Charter and the future of the licence fee. Now, logically, we should first establish what the BBC is for, what is its purpose, and then figure out the best way of funding that purpose. In reality, the debates on both these issues will run in parallel, and we will approach these discussions constructively and with an open mind. But I do think it's important we have a deep understanding of the needs and views of the public in any discussion of the BBC's future. That's why next year we will be launching a public engagement process so we can listen hard to what they have to say. Could we all do more to put audiences centre stage? Collaborate with local community organisations to reach underrepresented groups. Run social media campaigns to facilitate discussions and gather feedback. Create initiatives that specifically target younger audiences, such as workshops in schools, all to ensure that future generations and underrepresented groups are part of the conversation. Once the people who will have to pay for the BBC have had their say on what they want from the BBC, the debate about its future will be much more grounded in reality, rather than being distracted by preconceived opinions or ideological interests. I want to democratise the debate around the BBC's future. It will, I hope, introduce some much-needed common sense. And my personal commitment as chair is to make sure that those audience opinions and attitudes will inform our board deliberations on the Charter. The third and final area I shall focus on concerns the Royal Charter itself and the discussions surrounding our funding model. In my view, strengthening the independence of the BBC should be the lens through which these issues are explored and debated. There is nothing more important. Independence and its journalistic bedfellow impartiality is the reason our journalism is trusted. It's the reason the BBC brand is respected all over the world. And it's the reason the BBC continues to attract the very best people. So what does strengthening independence mean when it comes to reviewing the Charter and the funding model? It means nothing less than to depoliticise decision-making. Let's begin with the Royal Charter. The Charter is the constitutional basis for the BBC, typically renewed every 10 years or so, and which effectively allows us to exist. I was surprised to learn that other organisations which are brought into being by a Royal Charter, such as the British Council, the Bank of England, the UK, have no such expiry date. In fact, there are more than 1,000 charter bodies, and I'm not aware of any other that needs to be renewed like the BBC. When you add to the fact that the charter renewal process takes around 2 years, and the BBC is also subject to mid-charter assessment, the reality is an almost perpetual government review over the BBC. Should we consider the BBC also having a permanent charter like the others, or even an alternative constitutional basis for the BBC in law? Would the BBC's independence be strengthened or weakened if we were brought into being through legislation rather than a Royal Charter? Clearly, either of those two approaches would involve finding new ways of reviewing the BBC's performance and holding the BBC to account. Now, there are other governance changes we could consider. I can report that the unitary board structure works very well and I have a board made of exceptional individuals. But should we look again at how the total number of board members is set and whether that could be made more flexible? How can we ensure we are able to add new skills and experiences as the market rapidly evolves and our priorities change? These are just a few thoughts, and I would welcome ideas for constitutional innovation as charter renewal kicks off in the new year. Closely linked to all these discussions will be the debate about the BBC's funding and what is the right mechanism for the BBC to deliver its purpose in the digital age. The BBC board has already set out some key principles. Above all, we want a universal public service BBC that requires a universal funding model. And we have to be realistic that ideas like ad funding or subscription do not pass the test when it comes to the BBC's public service mission. Both introduce a commercial agenda, which means the priority becomes not how you serve British audiences, but how you profit from them. And putting some or all of BBC public service content behind a paywall is simply not compatible with the idea of public service. It prioritizes the needs of the better off, leaves behind the poorer, the more marginalized, or the digitally disenfranchised. But you know, whatever the future funding model turns out to be, anything from reforming the license fee to replacing it, or coming up with a whole new mechanism, the independence of the decision on the level of the license fee itself and how that money is spent will remain a key issue. Let me explain, with reference to the current state of affairs. The level of our funding is reviewed every 5 years. The government decides by how much the license fee should rise, if at all. The last 10 years or more have seen how successive license fee freezes and below inflation rises have created a constant sense of jeopardy around BBC funding. And contrary to popular belief, the money from the license fee is not handed directly to the BBC. It first goes to the Treasury. And the decision about how much of that money will then go to the BBC lies with the government. Not just that, it can also decide how some of it, or what does go to the BBC, should be spent. So, for example, in 2010, the government decided that rather than pay for the BBC World Service, as it had done since its birth in 1932, the license fee should fund it. And then in 2015, the government announced that it would no longer pay for free TV licenses for those over the age of 75. That became a thing for the BBC. Taken together, in the end, there's some changes here and there, those two changes added up to around £400 million a year today. And when you add to that the decision to freeze the license fee, and the money left to make programs is severely cut as a result of political decisions made by the government of the day. Any idea that our finances are at the mercy of the stroke of a government minister's pen will always come with the risk of damaging perceptions around the independence of the BBC. Of course, the BBC receives very considerable public money and must be accountable for how it is spent. That is beyond question. But whatever turns out to be the funding model of the future, we need to depoliticize the decision-making about the revenue raised. After all, we need to find the best approach for an organization, but that must not only be, but also be seen to be, wholly free of political pressure. So these are my three priorities: devolve the BBC, democratize the debate, and depoliticize decision-making. My message is that we cannot afford to take the UK's incredible creative and cultural wealth for granted. We have a sector that has proven its worth for over 100 years and evolved into one of the greatest economic assets. And it still has much further to go in drawing on the creative strengths of every corner of the country. PSBs and the BBC have the potential to not just survive, but thrive in this wonderful and exciting industry as it embraces new technologies and new ways of informing, educating, and entertaining us all. Get it right, and we can help the UK prosper creatively, culturally, economically in the years ahead. And we will make sure our very British success story can continue. Thank you all very much for coming and listening. Thank you.
thank you for sharing a lot of your thoughts, some big thoughts. And just to remind people, if there are any questions you have as well in the audience or on the live stream, we'll hopefully have some time to come to those before we finish up. 8 months in the job, as you say. Firstly, why is this a speech that you felt you wanted to make now?
Well, it's an interesting being the chair, because most people are always asking you, well, what are you going to do? What's your plan? What's your ambition? What do you want to do with the BBC? And it becomes a question that needs to be answered. I arrived in March. My first job was actually to get to understand and listen and hear what everybody's thinking, what the issues are, what the debate is around. And that really took me up to the summer. And the first slot, as it were, I thought, right, I must do something after the summer. Our initial idea was September. It turned out it had to be now. So it had to be done, and this was a good time. I needed to know enough, but not take so long that some people kept saying, well, what are you about? What do you want to do?
Now, you've mentioned, of course, there's lots of things you want to do in the job, some things that fall on your desk. You talked about the culture review that will be taking place. And in your time, two particularly big issues for the BBC have been that involving Hugh Edwards and Strictly. It can be a sense of deja vu. Reviews come, something else happens. Does anything change fundamentally? What can you say to people in and outside of the BBC, because it's important to those who work for the corporation as well, to have faith that things will change?
Okay, let me take in two parts. I completely agree with that. It's a good question. And I spoke to Graham Russell, who's leading it, that what I don't want is another review with another set of policy changes. I really want a much more practical, visible, we need to actually have steps we can take quickly so we really do demonstrate to the staff that we really care about this, we're going to do something about it, and we're going to act fast. So take, for example, one of the things that I mentioned. This sense that people who complain, it takes a bit of effort, courage to complain. They're then left dangling. Now, there are lots of reasons for that, legal reasons, HR reasons, but we need to find a way in which people are kept informed. We just need to find that, make people think, oh yes, it is being taken seriously, they are going to act on it, and we're going to do it. So I want action rather than yet another little proposal.
Is that something you have faith in?
Well, I have faith in Graham. I think we should do it. But can I just say about having faith in the BBC? I mentioned I went around the country, and whilst it is absolutely true, and I think unacceptable behaviour of people in power should be stamped out, absolutely. But now I go back a long way, and we've done a lot, really. 40 years ago, it was terrible. It's still not great in many places, but I don't want to underplay it, but, you talk to BBC people in the BBC, they love working for the BBC. They haven't lost faith in the BBC. What we need to do is, when we do find people who cross the line, they believe we will stamp it out, and that's what I want to do.
I'll move on, because I do want to get to plenty of topics. Another kind of one of those big, I guess, cornerstones of the things you were just talking about were the idea of making the Royal Charter permanent. Also recognising the need for there still to be accountability.
Yes.
How would you envisage that work? You get your permanent charter. How is the BBC held to account?
Well, let me first say that I'm raising these ideas for constitutional innovation, of which permanent charter is one of them. I do think it's just odd that we're the only body that's reviewed every 10 years. And the problem with that, it's not about judging our performance or measuring what we do or holding us to account. It's got not to do with that. It's about this constant, every 10 years, but as it happens, it becomes almost regular. A root and branch review of everything we do, including our very existence. Now, you take something like Channel 4, which is brought into being by statute. Well, they don't review whether it should exist or not, but it's still properly governed and there's a proper oversight. It just seems to me a distraction to have this. Of course, like with legislation, you can always repeal it or you can always revoke a charter. But this is a really time-consuming thing where you're just going through the detail of including, in reality, it is possible that on January 28th, BBC stops existing and the government just sells off its assets. I mean, what we should do, the government, and should have the confidence in saying the BBC is a really good thing, and we should, of course, review it and measure its performance, but we shan't challenge its very existence and everything that it does, every little bit. And we don't need to do that. We can maintain proper governance and oversight without having this 10-year review.
And can you see how, you talk about how putting almost the power into the public's hands, as the public, depoliticise the decision-making.
Oh, yes.
Does that review process that does currently happen, do you think for some, though, actually that is a way of the BBC being seen to be being regulated and held to account and reviewed?
Yeah, I was very clear. What I'm asking for in constitutional innovation, whether it's through banning the 10-year review or creating us through legislation, has nothing to do with reviewing our performance or holding us to account or making sure. So we'll continue to be in front of select committees. We'll continue to have our remits go. There is, sitting under the Charter, a framework agreement that spells it all out. I'm not suggesting we change that. So it's really important to say I'm not talking about not keeping oversight, both political oversight and every other kind of oversight. The board oversees the BBC. But it's just this rather, what's the word? It's a great distraction, We spend a lot of time and effort on basics. And given that, the Bank of England is another Royal Charter, we don't think about it being every 10 years, or should we have the Bank of England or not? Or indeed, when you're creating legislation, you don't think, should we have Channel 4 or not? You still control it. You still always have the final power of repealing it, revoking it.
And I guess a yes or a no, so we can move on as well. But for the 2028 negotiations, is that something that you would hope is a realistic prospect in that kind of a shorter term, or is it a longer term ambition?
What I'm doing today is to raise questions. Quite often debates is set out by saying, this is what I want and here's the answer. I think what I'd like to do is to have a proper full debate about it, and then once we've gone through the process, we can see what the answer is.
Moving on to funding then, which,
yes.
For a lot of people, it becomes kind of a linked conversation.
Yes.
Giving more power to the audience in that respect, and, you say have faith that people will want to back the BBC. The government's elected, of course, by the public. So is that, in essence, not already happening? The power's not already kind of in the public's hands?
Over the funding model?
When it comes to the funding model of the BBC?
Well, let's look at decision-making and the power. I think it's worth finding out what the public want from the BBC. Proper, deep understanding of what they want from the national broadcaster. And then, once we can discuss what is the best way of funding it. At the end of the day, it is in the hands of the government, and it is Parliament that should decide. But all I'm asking for is, in that debate, let's hear from the people that matter, the people who will pay for it, and what they want from a national broadcaster, and do a proper, deep understanding of it. As I said, let's talk to young people, let's talk to marginalised. All of these people pay the licence fee, or whatever the reformed version of it, because universal service is really important. So let's hear from them.
And so it's a no to subscriptions, to kind of a part of the BBC that might be behind some form of a paywall, all things that have been suggested as part of this conversation.
Okay. So let me be clear what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the BBC's public service mission, not the commercial operation. So when the board has discussed no ads and no subscription, we're talking solely about public service. And the reason for it are several. One is, once you make it an ad-based or subscription-based, you stop serving the whole people. You serve the advertisers. You serve the subscribers. So it completely undermines the notion of a universal BBC, which is why we don't think it's a good idea.
Devolving the BBC. Essentially moving teams, moving programme, moving content making out of London. You wanted to work faster.
Yes.
And by that, do you mean, move to more places quicker? Or actually, how do you make sure that when you do move to a place, when teams are relocated or start up in a new place, that they actually become ingrained, they become reflective of the local society, part of the fabric of the place, and there are career paths in those locations. How How do you measure the success of that? How do you make it happen?
Well, it's a good question. I'm going to for it to become a priority for me, that means as a board, we invite the executives to act on it, and they have to report back to us about what they've done on a regular basis, so we can oversee the extent to which the BBC is acting on this policy and making it happen. I mean, one of the things I was going to say, and I didn't, but you kind of touched upon it, is I think we've done pretty well in moving from one metropolitan to another metropolis. I think there's something to be said, and indeed this morning, or yesterday when I was talking to the Leeds team, there was a mention about, it's not just going from city to another city, a metropolitan, but we should go out into the towns and local areas as well. I think that's quite an important part of, redistributing the BBC across the country. I'm not saying that, it's not an easy thing to do. That's why, although, to be honest, once the BBC started, it started doing it really well. I was on the board when we decided to move the BBC to Salford, and there was quite a lot of resistance at the time. But just look at it now. I mean, it's such a success. You could do, and I have a great.
But then a lot of time has passed to kind of build an entire hub and kind of, to what it is today.
Yeah.
So how do you make that process almost quicker to create Salfords, in other parts of the country where you've got bases that are properly devolved, not still kind of leaning on London and there are fully fledged career paths.
Yes. Well, when you say make it quicker, I do think executives are moving as much as they can. I think if they know that the board and the chair really are keen on this, it just becomes a higher priority in what they do. But, it's quite complicated. It's not just, you can't just sign a pen and get everybody to move up. And I don't detect any lack of commitment to it within the BBC.
What do you see the impact of that, of the BBC doing that on the wider...
Oh, it's huge, isn't it? I mean, you just look at what's happened in Salford and elsewhere. And I do really believe in what Amal said. I think it's wrong for the BBC for people to think they've got to go to London to have a successful career. It's so important we tackle that.
But sorry, but what's the impact on other PSBs as well?
Other PSBs?
Yeah, what can it do for the industry?
Well, you can see that some other PSBs are doing, Channel 4 moving, got a big operation here. I don't run the other PSBs. I think what we have to demonstrate that this is good for PSBs and good for Britain because we are all public service broadcasters. Now, let's be clear. We are very fortunate in having public money. Right? ITV doesn't. It has to make its money from advertising. So we can do things that aren't formally and clearly commercially driven. Whereas if you think about moving the BBC around, it becomes more complicated, more difficult to manage, and you can see it's even harder for ITV to do that. And if you think about what's happened to ITV over the last 25 years, it's consolidated to a central, but because it's a more efficient way of doing things. So it would be not for me to tell ITV how it should manage it, but I do think as public service broadcasters, we should, do right by the British public everywhere, wherever they live.
Just a reminder, I'm going to come to any audience questions in just a few minutes. I'm going to ask you on one more area, which is news and impartiality.
Oh, yes.
Your background, my background. Is it that being impartial and impartiality is getting harder? Because obviously we know that there are journalists at the BBC, not least, that are striving to do their utmost to maintain that day in, day out? Or is it that for audiences to almost know it when they see it, that's getting harder in a world that's full of unchecked facts, opinions?
I think it is getting harder because the source of information is so varied and people are full of all sorts of stuff that isn't true. So for us to demonstrate that you can trust us because we're telling you, we're giving you real evidence, real facts, and we're seeking truth. It's a harder job to do because they hear from other sources. When they didn't have other sources, it would be such a problem. I think it's particularly hard right now because we have some very, very difficult sources, especially in the Middle East. It's such a polarizing thing. And I was talking to somebody, you can play a single piece of reporting by a BBC correspondent, and depending on which side people are, they'll think it's biased the other way. It's the same piece. So it's a very polarizing thing, and that makes it more difficult for us to be impartial. I think one of the things that we've tried to do under Deborah, who runs the news, is to be open and transparent about how we do things, what we do, and why we come up with them. I think that's been very helpful to reveal the workings. I think that's a very good step forward in trying to establish in the mind of our viewers and listeners that you can trust us.
In the World Service as well, of course, prominent current affairs and news output, and perhaps not everybody, in the UK obviously consumes it as much, but a pillar of the BBC. What do you make of the funding from the government announced last week and its contribution to, I guess, impartiality in some of the parts of the world you mentioned?
BBC World Service is a really, really important part of what the BBC does. It's in terms of its reputation. As I said, I do think it wasn't right that suddenly it became a responsibility for us to pay, the license fee payer to pay for it. The government should have done that. I'm very grateful for the money the government have recently done. It's been enormously helpful in keeping some services going and continuing to do the job. We keep reworking World Service to make it better, but it does a great job. It's really hard. One of the consequences of being paid by the license fee payer is that, of course, because we've had to deal with a lot of cards and we've lost revenue, 30% in the last 10 years, that the World Service is caught up in that as well, because it's now paid for the license fee. So it has to bear its fair share of cuts as long as with everything else, and that doesn't seem to be right. It would be much better off if the government paid for it. It would then be protected from whatever we have to do with license fee, or whatever its replacement is. And I'm very grateful for the money that they have given just now.
Audience, it's your time. Pop your hands up and just wait until a microphone gets to you so that we can hear your questions on the stream as well. Who's going to get to a mic first? It looks like to be one on this side.
We have a press question on the live stream from both Deadline and The Times. You suggest more radical thinking is needed to protect the long-term future of public service broadcasting.
Oh, right, okay, I can see now.
Are there plans to merge PSBs to stand strong against the muscle of US streaming services?
Just say that last thing again. I just missed that.
Sorry, I'll say the full question. You suggest more radical thinking is needed to protect the long-term future of public service broadcasting. Are there plans to merge PSBs to stand strong against the muscle of US streaming services?
What I was saying is that I think that the British PSBs do an amazing job, and it's something that we should protect in the face of the competition we have. My call is to allow us to collaborate where we can and compete where it matters. I think collaboration and competition is the right way, but we should be free, I think, to be innovative about what we can do and how we can meet the challenge. It's a collective challenge, so it's worth us thinking about in what ways we can collaborate, in what ways we need to continue to compete to give the public a choice.
There was a couple of hands over this side of the room as well. Oh, okay.
Hi. My question is regarding funding. So you mentioned that you want funding to be more independent of the government, but then with the World Service, you also mentioned that you'd like the government to help continue with funding. So I wondered if you see a contradiction in those statements and how that would be addressed.
Okay. So let's just be clear what I'm talking about. There is a mechanism by which we raise money. At the moment, it's called a license fee, and there may be some changes. The other half, which is what I'm talking about, independence, is what do we do with the money raised? And I have particular concerns about when the money is raised, the Treasury gets it, and they have all sorts of views about how we should spend that money. That's how it came about with the over 75s. On the business of the World Service, there's a slightly different question. The license fee payer pays for domestic output. Right? And the World Service has always been paid for by the government. The relationship between the World Service and the government is established in such a way the World Service remains independent from the government, but its funding comes from the government. So it's a question of where the money comes from, and then after that it's a question of how do you ensure independence. My view is about when the money goes to the Treasury, how do we ensure that the BBC is seen to be free of political actions? And those two examples I gave were demonstrations of political actions, which I think we would be well used to not have anymore.
Where are the nearest mic? Yeah, brilliant.
Firstly, I just want to say thank you very much for your speech. My name's Kirsty Mitchell. I'm from the University of Leeds. I'm a former BBC employee, actually, some 27 years. But I wanted to talk to you about devolution. You mentioned a little earlier that you were speaking to the team in Leeds about not just getting into our cities, but also into our towns. And I wondered if we could look to the past to innovate in that space. So when I first joined the BBC way back when, we had something called district officers, and we had them in Wakefield, and we had them in Huddersfield, and we had them in Halifax, and Barnsley, and Doncaster, and we had small teams, admittedly small teams there, but they were on the ground, and they were seen by those communities. Is that something that we could perhaps go back to in the future?
Well, okay. So let's be realistic. I completely agree with you, and I like the idea that we should just move not just in the metropolis, but also go to local towns. But there's a hard check here, which is our financial constraints. And if we didn't have financial constraints, we'd like to do all that. So it's a question of striking the right balance. I know that sounds like a real cliche, but it's true. Tim and his team have to work with the money they've got, and therefore they've got to make hard choices. But my view is that I think in those choices, they should also think about moving into the towns as well as the cities. Now, quite how many towns you can move into and what can be done there is really a function of the kind of money we have to spend in those areas. And I can't say, oh, we don't have infinite money. We have to work within the money we have.
Have you got a mic? Just here? It's actually, there we go, it's coming to you. There we go.
Hi there, Tara Conlan. I'm a journalist writing for The Guardian and broadcasting the RTS.
Could you just speak up? I just can't quite.
I'll put the microphone a bit closer, that's better. Hi there. Can I just check, Samir, there, following up the question, are you categorically ruling out any merger of the PSBs? There was quite a lot of talk recently. Any merger of the PSBs? There was talk recently about some kind of potential merger with Channel 4. And then also, 500,000 people cancelled their licence fees last year. So obviously it makes sense to move out into the towns. But Tim Davey also said in March that the BBC would begin looking at ways of making the licence fee more affordable to people on lower incomes. Could you just give us an update on that, please?
Okay. I'll just repeat my point when you talk about other PSBs. What I'm asking for here is that PSBs face common challenges, and where we do have common challenges, we can think creatively and innovatively about how we can collaborate. Having said that, of course, we also have a duty to compete with each other for the British people. So, I should be clear that when I'm raising here questions and thoughts, I'm not coming up with here's an answer to something. This is something that we should be, and when I made that point, it was about the regulatory framework within which we operate. And I think what I was asking for is some future-facing regulatory framework, so we are able to be creative and innovate, because, you know, the streamers, and they just keep changing, they keep moving, they do things whilst we're still negotiating, they're moving ahead, and we can't keep doing that. If we've got to compete with them, we should be free to think about how best we can together compete and with the new players, but also compete with each other. I think it's a complicated set of equations. I just want the freedom to be able to think creatively about it.
Joint ventures between you, like BritBox, say, was?
Well, I mean, as I said, I'm not ruling anything in or out here. I'm just saying let's be free to think about what would be the best way of doing it. Where are the best areas for us to collaborate, and where should we continue to compete is what I would say.
We have got quite literally 3 minutes, so quick answers, if possible, to one more question.
Right, okay.
There we go.
Hello, hi. I'm just wondering. I lost my train of thought. Oh my god. Sorry. I'm just wondering because a lot of social media they obviously they really. Sorry. a lot of social media, they really like apply to younger people, and like the BBC, a lot of public service broadcasters, I feel like they just don't represent younger people, youth culture, all sorts of different minority cultures as well. Like I see a lot of them use influencers to try to appeal to that, but I still don't feel as if they're really promoting the culture and allowing people to innovate themselves, allowing young creatives to create their own shows and innovate themselves. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, but if you're...
What would you like to see in that regard, perhaps?
So, like, how do you think that public service broadcasters will be able to provide maybe a platform for younger people to create and innovate?
I think it's a really good and important question, and I can assure you that when I talk to people in the BBC and Tim and all his team, there's nothing that care more about than trying to reach younger audiences, because they are our future. They're the future license fee payers. And they are changing in the way they consume things, the way their habits are, and we are running to keep up with them. Don't doubt that we are trying to reach them, and we're going to find every kind of way to see, well, how do they behave? What do they consume? How can we be there? How can we influence, be part of their life and their world? And trust me, we are trying really hard. If only for our own self-preservation. We have to reach the younger generation, and I can tell you that we are trying very hard to do that.
We are, I'm so sorry, because a few more hands just went up, but we are going to have to end it there. So thank you for being here, for listening, for asking questions, and Samir, thank you for sharing your thoughts as well.
Thank you.